Hi, and welcome to session number 6 of the Mayamiko Introduction to Natural Dyeing course. This session is really exciting because we're starting to get to the heart of what natural dyeing is all about. And today's session is called Extraction, Creating Colour. So the extraction process really means how we're going to encourage the plants to release their colour so that we can create beautiful dyes. And this process includes, again, some techniques which will be very familiar to you: weighing, washing, adding water, all very familiar processes which you'll come across in your day-to-day life, whether that's cooking or working in the Mayamiko workshop. So this part of the process is split into 4 areas. Firstly, we're going to wash and prepare the dye plants. Then we're going to weigh the dye plants, then add those dye plants to the pot, and we're going to add water, and then we're going to boil and extract the colour. To start with, we're going to have a think about how we wash and prepare the plants. Now, this can be a part of the process which is often overlooked. We forget to dedicate time to this part, and actually it can be pretty time consuming. So it's always great to bring a few people together to help make this part of the process a lot quicker and easier. If you take a look at this photo taken in Sri Lanka in the workshop, the two women are taking the skins off the avocado stones, and they're doing this because it helps the stone become much darker in colour because it's more released to the oxygen. So each different plant has a different kind of caring process that we can go through to help encourage the colour to be released. But the main key points to this part of the process are around removing any hulls or shells or stems or part of the plant that are not needed for the dyeing. We need to wash the plants to remove any dirt. We don't want any dirt getting into the dye vats that could stain or affect or alter the colour. Cut the plant into smaller sections so that it fits really easily into the dye pot. We don't want kind of things poking out. We need to be able to get the lid on. And so if we've got big leaves or bark or lots of produce, then it's good to be able to make it smaller so it fits really well into the pot. And then, like I mentioned, some plants, for example the avocado stones, they really benefit from having their skins removed and being cut in half or split open, because when this happens, the stones turn a much darker kind of orangey black colour, which helps us create a much stronger colour. The next part of the process is about weighing the dye plants, and you'll be familiar with this kind of concept because we went through it when we were talking about weighing the fabric and bundling the fabric. But weighing the dye plants, let's take a look at the workshop here, is really about making sure that we have the exact right amount. And we start off whilst we're sampling with 50% of dye plants to the fabric weight. But as you can see here, Mina is putting some eucalyptus leaves onto the scales, and the eucalyptus leaves are really, really lightweight. And so 50% of eucalyptus leaves will be very different to, for example, 50% of avocado stones because they're much heavier. And this is where we need to start sampling and making sure that we have a proportion of weight which is really unique and specific to each plant. Once we've weighed our dye plants, we can then add the dye plants into the pot and cover with water. We don't want to add too much water. We just want to add enough water so that the plants are nicely covered and they can boil and simmer away. The more water that we add, the more energy and time it will take for the water to boil, and so this will increase the length of our process. It's also a good idea to check the pH of the water each morning, and you can do this through using a pH meter or a litmus paper. And what this will help us do is we'll be able to see if there's any changes in the water quality from being more acidic to more alkaline. And further down the line, if we get a colour on the fabric that we're not expecting, then if we've checked the water pH, it will help us problem solve this issue. So now we've weighed our dye plants and we've cleaned our dye plants, and they're all ready and they're in our pot with water ready to get going. There's a few key points that we need to go through before we start boiling and extracting the colour. So water temperature is really important and it affects the final colour. We want to gently simmer the plants and not to overboil them. This will bring out the best colours, especially if we're doing a pink or a red colour. Pinks and reds really like to be looked after really carefully and the colour teased out of them slowly. If you're using nuts or roots or bark, it's often sometimes really helpful to soak the plants in cool water for a few days before boiling, as this will help prime the plant to release the colour. It kind of softens them and gets them really ready for the boiling process. The whole point of this part of the process, the whole point of boiling and simmering the dyes, is so that the plants release their colour, and we want to get as much use out of each plant as possible. And so, usually we'll boil for a period of 2 to 3 hours, but it might be that there's much more colour that could come out of the plant. And this depends a lot around the quantity of plants that you're using and boiling at the time. So if, for example, you've been boiling them for a few hours and it's the end of the day and you need to go home, you can most definitely leave the plants in the pot or move them into a separate bucket, add water to them and leave them soak. And this will also help release the colour. And you might even find that the colours change over a period of time. So usually we get our brightest colours from the first kind of initial extractions, and then over a period of time, if you do it over a few days, the colours get much more earthy in tone. If you do leave the plants over a period of days, reboiling them will kill any bacteria, or sometimes you'll get a bit of mold on the top of the colour, and so boiling is really key to killing all of that and revitalising the vat. And then from a health and safety point of view, when we're boiling the plants, make sure that you keep all of your paper, your notepads, any fabric, any flammable objects away from the open flame, and just check out what you're wearing. Any loose pieces of clothing or any scarves, make sure that they're really securely fastened because we don't want any accidents. So we're going to take a look now at a video around the process of boiling and extracting the colour. So here we've got some pomegranate skins simmering away in a pot, and we recommend simmering for 45 minutes to 1 hour until the water has turned a different colour. After that period of time, pour the water from the pot into the bucket using a sieve and a cloth, just like in this video. The sieve and the cloth collect all of the plant debris, and you can see that the pomegranate skins have started to go really mushy, so that's why the cloth is really important. Once you've got all of the dye out of the pot, then you can put the plants back into the pot. Shake out the cloth, wash the cloth out, and refill with cool water. And what we want to do is we want to keep repeating this process that you've just seen, because we want to increase the amount of dye in the dye bucket. That big green bucket, we want to increase the amount of dye in there. And so we do that through a period and sequence of different extractions. And so that process you've just seen, we're going to keep repeating it. So after the first time that you've boiled the plants and tipped it into the dye bucket, you'll have a small amount of colourful dye at the bottom of your bucket. But we want to increase that amount and get as much colour out of the plants as possible. So we're going to put the plants back in the pot, add some more cool water, boil for another 45 minutes to 1 hour, and then tip that into the same dye bucket and increase that percentage of dye. And then we're going to do it again for extraction number 3. And so the amount of dye in our bucket is increasing, but it's really important that the fabric is fully covered when it's in the dye bucket. And to do this, because the dye is quite concentrated, we need to add more water. And adding more water will dilute the dye, but we'll have the same amount of dye particles in that bucket, okay? When you add water, it just means that it kind of just takes a bit longer for the colour to absorb into the fabric. But it's much more important that all of the fabric is covered with water, otherwise we'll get patches. So it's about, for us to do this whole process, it takes around 2 to 3 hours. But like I mentioned, if after boiling it for the 3rd time, if after boiling the plants for the 3rd time, you can see that you still have, some colour left in the plants, then definitely boil them again and get as much colour as you can out, because that will just mean that we can have an even stronger dye. So when we're doing multiple dye plants at a similar time, it can get a bit confusing about remembering when we started something, when the next extraction is, when it ends. And so it's good to kind of keep note of what you're doing. And in the workshop, we use a whiteboard, but you could use a chalkboard or a notepad. And it's about noting down the start time of when you start to boil each plant. So for instance, if the avocado stones, we start at 9 a.m. in the morning, then you'll know at 9:45 it's time to do the first extraction. And then you put the plants back in the pot, add more water, put back to boil, and then at 10:30 you repeat it. And then again with the pomegranate skins, if we start this an hour later, you can keep track of the times. And you can see here at the bottom, I've also included the tannin from the ground nuts. And this is important because we're going to be doing this extraction process for both the tannin and the final dye colour. So here we can have a look at our middle layer and our top layer of the fabric. And so the middle layer is our light brown fixer dye, and we're going to use this same process for extracting the colour from the tannin, and we're going to do the same process for the final colour dye. And I know it might feel like a lot, very time consuming, and it does take time, but as you go through it, you'll really speed up and you'll start to understand, what's involved in the process. So next session, we're going to be looking at dyeing the fabric. So now we've extracted all the colour from the plants and they're in the dye pots, we are going to be learning about how we get that colour onto the fabric and the process that takes. So I hope that makes sense and you now have an understanding of this stage of the process. And yeah, wonderful. See you in the next video. Bye.